recording this session so that you're all aware. Today's session will be recorded. Welcome, first of all. This is the second in our new housing webinar series. The first was presented a couple weeks ago by Wyndham Windsor Housing Trust, and a recording of that webinar is available on Wyndham Regional Commission's Community Development page. The third webinar will be held 2 weeks from now. I think it's 2 weeks from now, but it's December 1st anyways. And that the topic of that will be focus on zoning issues as they relate to housing. Today's webinar is going to focus on infrastructure issues, especially in our village centers, but throughout the region, and as those issues relate to housing. All of these webinars are co-sponsored by the Wyndham Regional Commission, Wyndham Windsor Housing Trust, and the Mount Ascutney Regional Commission. My name is Susan Westa. I'm the Community Development Lead here at the Wyndham Regional Commission, and we have Chris Campany, our director, with us today, who is going to be presenting. We also have John Bennett, our associate director, on as well. And feel free to reach out to any of us at any time if you have any questions. But before I turn it over to Chris, I would just like to remind you, if you're not speaking, to keep yourself muted. And if you have questions, we'll try and keep them till the end, but please feel free to put them in the chat box. I will be monitoring those questions throughout Chris's presentation. If you do have a clarifying question or something that needs immediate attention, you can add those to the chat box too, or try and raise your hand, and I'll be on the lookout for folks who are trying to get our attention. But with that, I think at this point, I'll turn it over to Chris.
Thank you, Sue. Appreciate it. And thanks for pulling this together. And I just real quick, Paul, I didn't know if you wanted to say hi from the Housing Trust, and Jason Rasmussen, if you wanted to say hi from Mount Ascutney Regional Commission.
Sure. Hi, I'm Paul Bonarano. I'm the rental rehab program coordinator with the Wyndham and Windsor Housing Trust, and I'm here with the rest of everyone else trying to learn about infrastructure. So thanks for having me say hello.
Jason, you want to say anything?
Sure. Hi, I'm from Mount Ascutney Regional Commission, and thanks for joining us tonight. We certainly know housing's a big issue. And we also know infrastructure is a big issue, and there's really never been a better time to find money to help with that sort of thing. So, excuse me, Chris, we look forward to hearing what you have to say tonight.
Thank you both. So I'm going to present here in just a second. I think when I do share the screen, it's going to be like I'm a submarine commander. I don't think I'm going to be able to see any of you guys. So I'm counting on Sue to be my eyes and I guess ears once I get presenting. Okay. And just briefly, the reason, just so anybody who didn't participate in the first presentation, the way this came about was Elizabeth Bridgewater, the director at Wyndham Windsor Housing Trust, was getting calls from a number of towns about housing. What can we do about housing with the advent of the American Rescue Plan Act funding? And then we at Wyndham Regional Commission were also getting calls. So what we thought we would do is organize this series of presentations to kind of get into what it actually takes to build housing. Tonight, what I'm going to present on village center housing infrastructure, I'm not going to get into the nitty gritty of like system engineering and design and programs. A&R is actually, and Sue, I'm sure we can get the information out to all the participants about the Agency of Natural Resources presentations they're going to be doing on their wastewater programs. You know, with the new infrastructure bill that was just passed, there's a lot more money in there for wastewater and water. So I'm not going to get into the, and then USDA has its own programs. I'm not going to be getting into the nitty gritty of all that. What I'm going to be trying to do is offer how to have the conversation about housing and infrastructure, especially for villages, because a lot of our villages do not have any community water or sewer, but yet there are compact settlements where it'd be a good place for housing to go. How to actually try to have those conversations in your town and maybe go over some relationships that you haven't necessarily thought of before. So hopefully this will be helpful to you. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. Wish me luck. Here we go. There. How's it looking, Sue?
Looks great.
Okay. So the context here, what we're going to be talking about is developing new housing in quantity. And I'm talking about, like, developing 20 to 30 units at a time. Some single family, but also multifamily and rental units to meet current and future housing needs. Brattleboro I'm on their housing task force, and I don't think I'm telling a tale out of school to say they just did a housing study, and their need right now is 500 units. So again, hope I'm not pulling the curtain back prematurely on that, but really for the region as a whole, we're talking hundreds of units, not a couple units here or there, because we're in full-blown crisis mode, and that's before we even really start thinking about accommodating new people. So, and this is not about custom build or speculative home building on large lots in rural areas. The emphasis here is on housing in and around compact settlement for a couple of reasons, not only because there's a policy imperative, but because there's a need to achieve economies of scale. So if you're familiar with town planning or regional planning in Vermont, the very first goal for regional planning and development efforts is, number one, to plan development so as to maintain the historic settlement pattern of compact village and urban centers separated by a rural countryside. Intensive residential development should be encouraged primarily in areas related to community centers, and strip development along highways should be discouraged. Economic growth should be encouraged in locally designated growth areas employed to revitalize existing village and urban centers, or both, and should be encouraged in growth centers designated under yada yada. Public investments, including the construction or expansion of infrastructure, should reinforce the general character and planned growth patterns of the area, and development should be undertaken in accordance with smart growth principles as defined by statute. So if you look at your town plan, there's a 99.9% probability that you will have this language in your town plan. And more likely than not, even in the introduction to your town plan, where you offer the vision, you're probably going to say something to this effect, that we want to, maintain our rural landscape and concentrate growth in and around our village centers, or downtown if you're one of the communities that has a downtown. But then also there's the imperative of the economies of scale. And if you participated in the last the discussion that Windham Windsor Housing Trust presented, we're talking about building housing at scale to accommodate housing that's affordable to people who need it. Who are those people? It's our family members, it's our friends, it's our neighbors. We talk a lot about employee housing, but another way to think of employees are those people that we desperately need in our communities to help us with with the things that we want and need. So I'm going to take us back in time, all the way to October 27th, when Windham Windsor Housing Trust had the lead presentation. And I'm going to just very briefly summarize what they told us. And this was with regard to people in both Windham County and Windsor County. And for folk who don't know, the Windham Regional Commission, we covered 27 towns, and it's all 23 towns in Windham County, Reedsboro, Searsburg, and Winhall, and Bennington County, and Weston and Windsor County. So these numbers would hold true for that whole area, and then also the Mount Scottney Regional Commission area. The largest growth in terms of population of these counties, of this area, these two regions, is seen in the 62 plus age group. And then we've also seen real growth in the 35 to 44 age group, which are, working age population, and also the age of people who are likely to have families. But importantly, the most prevalent household size is that the needs are between one or two persons, and that makes up almost 70% of all renters. Now, this information here is about renters, but honestly, this applies to buyers as well. This is the group of people that we're talking about. 61% of households age 35 to 44 make up to $75,000 per year, and 52% of households age 65 and up make less than $35,000 per year. That's important because that tells us the level of income that we have to work with and the rents and the mortgages that people can afford. And that's a good percentage of our population. So a typical renter's profile in the demographic most likely to grow, the 62 up and up age group, they tend to be older couples, income from Social Security and some modest retirement savings, typically desire a 1 or 1+ bedroom unit, average affordable rent, which and affordable is generally thought to be what you can afford if you spend 30% of your income is $625. The smaller demographic but critical is the family renter. It's the head of household, roughly is 40 years old, generally working, generally looking for a 2-bedroom, potentially 3-bedroom. Income ranges between $30,000 and $75,000, and average affordable rent is $1,250. Again, just kind of providing the scope of who we're talking about. And critically, one of the things that we really wanted Wyndham Windsor Housing Trust to talk about is where do the costs go when we talk about building housing, whether it's through Wyndham Windsor Housing Trust or a private developer. And generally speaking, the total development costs are trending around $325,000 per unit or more, depending on the specifics of a given development. And the main cost drivers of the construction are, and this is going to be real important when we get to the infrastructure discussion, the main cost drivers are the cost of construction. Those are hard costs. And then normal soft costs, including design and acquisition. And so they provide information about the snow block that they just did in downtown Brattleboro. And the total cost of that development was around $7.5 million. And so Peter Padgett presented this, then said, so what would a for-profit development look like? And he identified some areas where they might be able to save for a variety of reasons, including just different standards that they may not have to meet that Wyndham Windsor Housing Trust would. But in a nutshell, that doing the snow block, that same number of units, generally speaking, the cost would be around $290,000 per unit. So, not a lot difference. If you think in terms of a 30-year mortgage, right? The difference between, or ultimately rental income, is just between $325,000 and $290,000. It's not inconsequential, but it's not a huge amount of money when you're talking that scale. So one of the, and so Peter then went on to talk about, so if your total development cost for a for-profit developer, if the total development cost, again, less than Wyndham Windsor Housing Trust, but if the total development cost was around $6.7 million for a 23-unit building, let's say they had a loan of about $4.5 million, and then and had their own private equity investment of about $2.3 million. The average rents that it would take to support that development would be about $2,350 per month. That means it would be affordable for people with incomes of around $94,000 based on that 30% rule. Based on a married couple with 1 child after tax income, they would need an income around $117,500. So that same rent payment could support a $500,000 mortgage. So I just wanted to just kind of put this in context. So we're not talking in terms of, we're talking about basic, good, comfortable, efficient homes. And in this case, really probably talking multifamily, so we can achieve efficiencies of scale. And we're not talking here about, marble countertops, jacuzzi tubs, saunas, and other things like that. We're talking good quality, stable housing. And so then Peter went into what does it take to attract funding to your town. And the first thing he noted was building and operating private sewer and water systems is costly. Current public policy guidelines, as far as getting funding to support housing, is pointing towards towns with municipal infrastructure, and water and sewer are most important. Of course, sidewalk systems and transportation, and transportation there can specifically mean access to transit is also considered, because you want people in housing to be able to generally be able to walk to where they to goods and services that they need. Doesn't mean they won't own a car, but you generally want to develop in places where walking can be a preferred system of mobility. And then parking, as he notes, is often overlooked. Some towns require way too much parking, which can be really expensive, can add a lot of money to development, and unnecessarily so. And what Wyndham Windsor Housing Trust, their experience has been is that they used to do more scattered site development, but now they've tended to move towards larger single site developments, again, for economies of scale. But one of the important things in this picture that I want to show is those down there on the bottom left. Those are some of their properties in Brattleboro. And if you notice the scale of those, I think that they would be considered scattered site, but that's also the size homes that can contain a lot of apartments, and as you all know, could actually fit really nicely, fit well into the context of a lot of our villages, because most of our villages have the old inns, they have the old boarding houses, and other facilities that, you know, pretty large buildings. And if you think about the barns and other outbuildings that were attached historically to these buildings, you can really build some pretty sizable structures that fit in neatly with the overall kind of aesthetic context of our villages. And I'll get into more of that later. And then Peter noted that attracting funding to your town development doesn't happen in a vacuum. He's going back to the planning process. This is something that towns can control. A smart planning process can help guide development in a way that most benefits the town and residents. Well-integrated town plan provides guidance to zoning administrators, development review boards, select boards, and others, and provides a foundation of support for smart development. A strong municipal support can lead to a strong funding application. That really is, as he notes, in many cases is required if you want the housing trust or any other kind of partnership that requires government engagement, federal funding or pass through federal funding through the state. Often that's going to be required. And of course, regional commissions are here to help. And increasingly, to attract funding to your town, you have to do it in designated growth areas. And typically, the designated growth areas require water and sewer. So like designated downtowns, neighborhood development areas by definition really do have community water and sewer. New town centers, and then, as I note, designated village centers, if associated with an NDA, neighborhood development area. Again, that kind of the pre-qualification area is it has water and wastewater. And I can tell you, legislatively, and I serve on the Vermont Climate Council, this policy direction as far as really supporting housing in and around compact settlements is only getting stronger. And so some quotes from Peter: when no town sewer or water exists, we have to build our own systems, which is very expensive, especially for water systems. Now, if you think back to the snow block or the numbers that he gave, that did not include water and wastewater, because there were probably water and wastewater permits, but they weren't actually having to build a system. If you have to build a system, public water system, which is the definition of what multifamily housing requires, or a community wastewater system, that adds a lot more to the housing costs, and it can ultimately make the cost just unfeasible, and certainly take it out of the range of the people that we were talking about who are really in need of housing. He said, as I said, water and sewer are the most important and most costly. He noted that they typically build 20 to 30 unit rental developments, which is about what our communities can absorb. But he also noted that that's really where you start getting the economies of scale, and you start getting the most out of those hard construction costs. And again, it reiterated the total development costs in Vermont, not just for the housing trust, but really for any developers, around $325,000 per unit. And he notes that people hears all the time, this is crazy, there has to be a way to do it cheaper. But the main cost drivers is hard construction costs. So infrastructure do we need for housing? Well, you need a public water supply, and that's a regulatory term, and that basically means that you're providing a water supply that serves a specific number of residents. I think it's 25. There are all kinds. I'm not going to get into the details of it, but there are all kinds of different thresholds they have to meet. But basically, no, you have. It's a water supply that meets a higher standard, both in terms of quantity and quality, than just an individual on-site system that you might have. Well, you'd have for your house. Then you need a community wastewater system, and generally speaking, what we're talking about here is not a conventional system like Brattleboro, Wilmington, Dover, Bellas Falls, Rockingham would have, but rather a soil-based system where you may even have like individual septic system, but then shared gray water. There are a lot of ways to get to this, and we're certainly happy to host another webinar that gets into all the details about engineering these systems. But this is about planning for infrastructure and housing. Bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure is really good to help support housing, because it again, as I mentioned before, preferably you're going to want people are going to want to be able to walk and have bike ped mobility options. You're going to need reasonable parking, but not too much that drives up the costs. You really need to think about what's actually needed to support that housing development. You're going to want reliable high-speed broadband, and one of the benefits of compact settlement like a village is you start getting economies of scale. Ideally, you're going to have access to transit. That's limited to some corridors, but right now, Wyndham Regional Commission is participating in an effort led by Southeast Vermont Transit and V-Trans to look at fixed route transit on Route 30. We've already got fixed route on Route 9 and Route 5. But if we get a fixed route transit route in the Route 30 corridor, that would be huge. It would run from Brattleboro to Manchester. That we can do a whole other presentation on that too. And then you're going to need stormwater management. That's sometimes is an afterthought. As the flooding that we had in the region in July, and especially July 29th showed, it's really critical to manage stormwater well. And I'm not talking necessarily rivers and streams. I'm talking about just water flowing over the landscape, how important it is to keep it out of homes and properties. So you really do need to think about stormwater systems. Again, we can do a whole other presentation on that too. And what I would urge you to think about is, too often, I think when we talk about infrastructure support, housing or villages or anything else, we think of it as an engineering effort. And I would argue that comes later. This is a community development effort. The big picture is you really want to think about what's the role of the village in the community or town, and what are the services that would be a benefit to the community. I'm not just talking, it'd be great to have a brew pub and another restaurant or two, maybe a deli. I'm also talking about things like daycare, both for children and adults, and other things like that, where it makes sense to just have it in a centralized location, and where the larger community can come there and benefit from it. But there may also be immediate needs too. For instance, are there current health or environmental issues? I don't think we do enough engagement with our villages around checking to see are drinking water wells contaminated, and then also from an environmental perspective, is ground or surface water contaminated? Are there current business sustainability issues? Are businesses either becoming stagnant or declining because of the water or wastewater limitations? Oftentimes in villages, the lot sizes are so small, you really can't intensify the water use, which then ultimately translates into wastewater use. Therefore, a lot of businesses or homes are frozen in time with where they were in 2007. That's a critical date in Vermont's wastewater laws. Basically, any use you had in 2007 can be grandfathered in, but you still, if you have to replace a system, or if you want to expand intensification of use, it has to meet current standards. And then another big question are there current business or home retention issues? And the way I get at that, what I mean by that is, are more homes being torn down than are being built? And sometimes if you ask people like, why did your sale of your home go through? I can tell you, frequently I'll go back to the home inspection. It comes down to the septic inspection. It fails. They may have an older in-ground system. They may be told that they have to have a more expensive mound system, and the sale will fall through. I think that was perhaps more the case than the pandemic real estate purchasing surge, because we've had a number of people move into the region who have the means to do those improvements, but they can be very expensive for a current homeowner to make, or a prospective homeowner to make, and may not pencil out in terms of the overall value of the home. And just there's a graphic just describing what I'm talking about in terms of the health needs. One of the things that really in Vermont, you need a minimum 2-acre lot size to prevent shadowing of septic distribution systems and wells. Because what happens is you've got the wells sunk down into the ground, right? Then you have a septic tank and the distribution systems. And what happens is as that septic tank effluent moves in the groundwater, it can get into wells and contaminate them. And then ultimately, also, sometimes it can surface and cause surface water contamination. It can also cause groundwater contamination that may not affect the well at all, but it'll eventually show up in streams and rivers. So, if you think about our villages most of our villages when they were first created, our relationship with water was very different. We didn't use water nearly as intensively because, frankly, when these homes were built, these villages were built, constructed, it took a lot of work to get water into your house. So you weren't necessarily going to be, using it in a very casual manner. But now we kind of take that for granted. And, now under modern standards, you would not design a new village to have on-site septic and well. You would have a community wastewater and water system. And so we kind of need to go back and retrofit to accommodate potentially not only new growth, but what's already there, so you don't lose what you've already got. So what I urge folk to do is begin the process with a conversation in the community about what's wanted and needed, because this then provides the context for the more technical discussions to follow. Too often, if you start immediately jumping into wastewater engineering and scoping, or drinking water, community water scoping and engineering, immediately people are getting into what's it going to cost? Can we afford to do that? As opposed to why do we want to do it in the first place? What is it a value that we want to invest in to make this happen? And it should be an inclusive process. And I know that oftentimes we're talking about fixed locations like a village, and some villages are incorporated and have their own tax structure. We're also talking about, towns going through this process, but I would really encourage you to look more broadly at the larger community that a village serves, because that also informs the potential intensity of use and what it can actually support and what some of the needs are that it can actually support, and wants. So it gives you some idea about, the full range of possibilities of, because even when it comes to housing, you may think there's not enough activity in our towns to support a water or wastewater system to support all these other things that we want. But if you look at the larger community that actually comes to the village to use it, then it becomes the customer base may make more sense. So think about what exists now, what's at risk, what's needed, what's wanted, and then you figure out what it takes to achieve those goals. And that's when you can really start getting into, thinking about, okay, this is justification for why we should even explore having water and wastewater in the first place. And yes, it absolutely should include housing, but it'll probably include other things as well. So let's think for a minute about the role of housing in villages. Of course, it provides homes, but it also provides housing choices for different stages of life, like young adults, families with children, and people in their later years. It provides a customer base for local services and businesses within walking distance. But one of the things we oftentimes forget, a lot of people who make decisions in our towns, villages, probably, are of driving age and probably do drive, but we need to remember those under 16 and many over age 65 do not drive or cannot drive. And then there are others who don't drive or minimize driving by choice, and then there are others who just don't have the physical ability to do it as well. And so too often this focus on the car is kind of an inherently unjust and inequitable approach for our larger community. By having more housing in villages, it creates a condition that brings people together, and that can reduce social isolation. And this is a whole other topic we could talk about to what extent our rural social isolation leads to all kinds of other problems related to substance abuse and domestic violence. And I just know in my own circle of, social circle, the social isolation that already existed, then compounded by the pandemic, it's just been devastating. It can reduce the cost of living by reducing transportation costs, but also creates opportunities for sharing. And I would argue that even like mixing of generations, if somebody, this may not be a permanent fix, but if somebody needs someone to look after their kids because their job schedule changed over a weekend, you might be able to find somebody else in your village and around where you live who can look after your kids for that day because you've created those personal relationships. Or conversely, if you're an older person, your sight is going and you need to get to a doctor's appointment and it's not working out with the paratransit or other ride services, so I might just be willing to give you a ride because you have a larger social circle. You better achieve economies of scale for things like daycare and adult daycare, both child and adult, and things like high-speed broadband and transit access. Can also achieve a better economy of scale for things like cell service, where you might be able to put the cell infrastructure in a building there in the village. Then opportunities for other things like greater electrical system resilience. We put in for a earmark, don't know if we're going to get it, with Green Mountain Power to do something like they did in Panton, where of the 15 most at-risk communities as far as grid instability, 6 of the 15 were in the Wyndham region. And the idea is to create systems, and these would be these would be tailored to each area, that have more renewable energy, battery storage, and other things to try to create more resilience, so that if the grid is out, you've still got local sources of power until the grid can get catch back up to you. As well as things like energy efficiency, like district heating and cooling. And we're actually funding through the Clean Energy Development Fund, if it goes through, like a district heating project in Brattleboro, where it's conversion of the town office into offices downstairs and affordable housing upstairs. And you've got the library down the hill. We're providing support for a modern wood heat system, and that would result in greater efficiency using a more renewable source of energy, because you've got that density that otherwise you wouldn't be able to have. But then we also need to talk about the role of villages and towns. Checking my time. Hubs, for at least part of social life, they're critical hubs for the way we live. They provide gathering places like village greens, houses of worship, studios, dining, prepared food, bars, government and civic uses like town offices, post offices, schools, place where you can buy groceries and other staples, banking, or at least an ATM, maybe hardware, other staples, and lodging. Additional housing, importantly, means additional people, which means more viable villages, which we too often take for granted. And of course, villages have always been a host to affordable housing, always has been. And so, we know a lot of these public spaces. Here's Weston and Townsend, Londonderry, the civic uses that exist in our village. Here's the post office in Williamsville, a church in Townsend, town office in Townsend. Forgetting exactly, I think that is forget which town hall that is, but these are familiar places. Commercial services, banking in Newfane, the old Newfane Cafe. Visitor destinations like Vermont Country Store and then Grafton. And then in critical third places, of course, the market in Wardsboro provides a place for people to buy food and other goods and services, get gas. But critically, there's a term that are called third places, and these are, and I'll just read this. In contrast to first places, which are home, and second places, which are work, third places allow people to put aside their concerns and simply enjoy the company and conversation around them. Third places host the regular, voluntary, informal, and happily anticipated gatherings of individuals beyond the realms of home and work. The character of a third place is determined most of all by its regular clientele and is marked by a playful mood which contrasts with people's more serious involvement in other spheres. Though a radically different kind of setting for a home, but the third place is remarkably similar to a good home in the psychological comfort and support it extends. They are at the heart of a community's social vitality, the grassroots of democracy, but sadly they constitute a diminishing aspect of the American social landscape. And I think we're seeing that as we're kind of losing these places in our villages and elsewhere in our community. I shared a Diner Dan drawing from the Damn Diner, which kind of gets at the nature of these third places. One thing I really want you to take away is that housing, when I think about housing, what I really think about is people. And so with housing, you bring people, and with people, you bring life, energy, activity, and critical mass, and that just might save some of our villages. I can tell you, I think we too often take for granted just how fragile our villages are and how fortunate we are to have them. If you travel through a lot of the Mountain East, I used to work in upstate New York. I wish I could take people to the Catskills to show just how far we could potentially fall. And then elsewhere, where I grew up in Virginia, so many villages and small hamlets and all were abandoned because all the commerce moved to interstate interchanges. So we really need to support these places, and people are the lifeblood. And what brings the people there first and foremost, at least the regulars, is housing. So additional housing support infrastructure that you need to be thinking about. Again, as I've said a lot of times, I say it because it's really important, is walking and biking should be the preferred means of mobility, but we really need to think about universal year-round accessibility. Different people have different abilities, which means we've got to keep our sidewalks cleared and plowed, which is not easy to do, especially if that roadway is a state highway. Just trying to move those plow piles can be incredibly difficult. Broadband and cell phone service, sufficient parking, stormwater, sufficient street lights, street trees, which provide shelter and comfort, and frankly can also provide some traffic calming. And we need to design our compact settlements and the expansion of them with flood hazards in mind, because so many are adjacent to rivers and streams. So one of the approaches I really want to advocate for you are the benefits of conceptual planning and design. And what we do in this process is lay out how the village can grow on the inside and out. The best location for substantial new housing may actually be on the village edge as opposed to the village center, or elsewhere adjacent to neighborhoods. And consider how people move through the villages and relationships among uses, because this informs things like sidewalk needs and where they go, pathways, lighting, and vegetation. I'm going to share an example with you. This is a project that Wyndham Regional Commission did for the Putney Planning Commission in 2005 with the support from professional landscape architecture firms. Don't get caught up in the details. What I'm going to show you is the concept that's important. This was as always guided by a steering committee of Putney residents. It's really critical to have local people engaged. And what it did was it looked at the current context of Putney and the parcels there and their ownership, what was already there. And I'll just read this briefly, this description, this excerpt. That said in 2002, a village district inventory was completed for Putney Village. The inventory was initiated because of a town plan action step that directed the town to evaluate the current village district zoning requirements to ensure they permit future commercial and residential growth while maintaining a healthy and vital traditional village center. And so a build-out analysis complete as part of the inventory determined that potentially developable land in the village core is scarce. And for the village to accommodate some of the growth pressures on the town, development projects will have to be well thought out and occur at higher densities. In this case, the infrastructure is already there, but still, I would argue that this is this visualizing density type process, this conceptual planning can help you make the case or understand why you might want a community system. But it notes here in 2003, Putney received village center designation, and then a municipal water system was constructed in 2004 that then complemented the existing municipal sewer system. And this is what it looks like. This is I know that this what this is doing is saying here's available land. What might that available land be able to accommodate? It doesn't mean you have to build what's shown here, but it shows what in real terms, in terms of like scale drawings, in this case perspective, what you could actually build with the space that you have. Here's another showing Main Street in Putney and where the intersection where Kimball Hall Road goes up the hill, but it shows where you can get some development kind of on the edge of the village. It also shows the types of housing diversity that you can get. So you may get larger scale multifamily homes. You may have single family detached, duplexes, quadplexes, and other things. So that way you have more housing choice again for those different life stages that people experience. And there's another like easier scenario mapping that I would encourage towns to do, which basically looks at where does your current plan policy or zoning take you. This is from Marlboro back in 2005. They're working on their town plan now, so don't. This is just an example, so don't freak out people of Marlboro. So what this process did was ask Wyndham Regional Commission to say, look at our current zoning and tell us what the development pattern could conceptually look like. And so they have rural residential at 2 acres, another zone at 2 acres. These are minimum lot sizes, right? Conservation, 27 acres. And here's what we call a measles map. And this shows hypothetically what development could look like based upon the lot size allowed by plan policy or zoning. And it's true that not all these parcels may be developable. It's not saying that they could all be developed, but it shows that under the policies in the town plan or the zoning bylaws, this is what could happen to your landscape. And this could be problematic for all kinds of reasons, right? With regard to, again, that efficiencies of scale, all kinds of other things we're trying to achieve, like preserving habitat, not stringing out public road infrastructure. And then also, from that is a very energy intensive landscape, not particularly supportive of reducing greenhouse gases and creating a more climate resilient and adaptive community. And another thing we did quickly for Marlboro was model to show what a village development scenario would look like under the different minimum lot size scenarios. So here's the historical village with existing structures. I think you can see my cursor here just to orient yourself. Here's Route 9, here's Towns Hill Road, here's South Road, here's Ames Hill Road, here's South Road that continues on to, well, now it's going to be the Marlboro Music Center. But so that's the existing structures. And this is what it would look like at a 2-acre build out. And you see how scattered the buildings would be. And this would be under also the current conventional wastewater requirements, which would say you need a minimum lot size of 2 acres. But you see how it's not consistent with that village form. And then here's the 1-acre build out. It's a little bit better, but still pretty scattered relative to the historic settlement pattern. And then if you look at a 1/2 acre minimum lot size, you begin to get that you can better achieve that village settlement pattern. And you know, the form of a village, the actual physical space, really does make a difference, and it's in the experience of the people who live there and visit there, and frankly, its cohesiveness and its ability to serve that function of really being able to kind of bring people together. So that's it. Thank you very much, and now we'll go to questions. Now, quick sharing the screen.
Okay, so I don't see any questions in the chat box, but if anybody would like to raise their hand and let us know, or whether it be your Zoom hand or your real hand. That was a lot of information.
Paul had his hand up.
Yeah,
Oh.
I'm trying to, I'm looking for the little raise my hand thing down there, but I'm kind of curious in Vermont. I think one of the issues, as for an individual residence, perk testing for septic and things like that. And how much does the actual geology or landscape of the state kind of guide the principles of the development? You know what I mean?
I mean, really, it's a primary determinant of where you can build a house and what your system is going to be. The water table, the type of soils, how they perk, and especially down here with our soils, there are a lot of oftentimes requirements. There's going to be a mound system, which can be really, really expensive. And sometimes if you're on a really small lot and you need a very small distribution field, you may need an aerobic system. I had to have an aerobic system at my house in upstate New York. I had a 0.17 acre lot with septic and well. Back in 2002, that system cost about $68,000.
Wow.
And so I would imagine that, and these things, they're interesting because the septic, the tank, the receiving tank looks like a big upside down acorn. And then what it has is an air pump in it that keeps the air circulating. And so as opposed to a typical septic system, which is anaerobic and requires a lot more space for the bacteria to do their job, the aerobic system, it really kind of adds more energy to the system, and so it treats that water more quickly and therefore requires a smaller distribution field. Did that help, Paul?
Yeah, no, yeah, because, well, I'm just curious about, so the development, am I still on? Yeah, so the development of, if there was like a kind of a public investment in central systems that can be drained off without interfering with local streams or going into the, things like that. Maybe that, would that be a wise investment for some of these towns rather than like with the 2 acre thing, in order to do that, rather than building a larger full body wastewater system,
Yeah, that's exactly that's what I was mentioning earlier. That's exactly what we're talking about for these villages. Is not a conventional system like what you'd have in Brattleboro, but a soil-based system. So it may be you've got your individual septic on your property, and then it may be that the whole village, the gray water effluent goes to a single distribution field, or it could be like on one side of the road, 4 houses have a shared mound system. And then across the road, another group of houses have another system. But the important thing is you're managing it as a whole community system. And again, we can have a whole other conversation, a whole other presentation about the costs and benefits to the local property owners. But eventually, somebody who owns a property, probably within a lifetime of a mortgage, they're going to have to replace their septic system, and that's not cheap. And you may not have the land to do it. And it's probably not going to get any cheaper over time. So you can either, it's one of those kind of situations where pay me now or pay me later, but it also, if you have a community system, it also increases your options with what you can do with your property.
Yeah.
Margo has a question?
Thanks.
Hi. So one of the things that kind of crosses my mind, and I'm wondering what you would say, is I think in a lot of communities around here, there can be a reluctance to change, or especially change related to our historic villages, and actually not wanting to encourage growth in the villages because it's going to change the character of the village. And I'm just wondering, I know community conversations and a lot of talking is going to be one key factor for having, the ideas of change come about. I'm wondering what you might suggest or think about, have communities think about for those kinds of resistance.
Well, I guess the first question I'd ask is how do you feel about the path of least resistance, which is potential stagnation in villages? And then also the continued development of, if you want any housing, it's just whatever happens to happen on large lots out on class 3 town roads. If you don't plan for the actual development of housing, and if you don't plan for what it takes to even just sustain what you've already got in your village, much less develop in or around it, nature's going to take its course, and it tends not to be very friendly. It could be hard to make the case to invest, especially like in an inn or a market or some other commercial operation or an apartment building in a village center, if you don't have community water and wastewater because of just the sheer cost you have to, the level of investment that you have to make. And then if the developer is a private developer makes that investment in that property, who can afford it? And the big complaint that I hear in Vermont now is, well, all these people who have all this money are coming in and moving in, and I can't afford to live here anymore. Well, part of that's our own choice, because we make it really expensive for people to be able to live here, because you basically have to be able to afford that large lot and then be able to build the house on that lot out on the class 3 town road. And then we have increased demand to maintain and keep up those class 3 town roads. And that is there's another bargain that I think we don't, and I need to actually, maybe this would be a good project for our natural resources planner. One thing that I would really like to do is, we may be reluctant to make the investment in a community or wastewater system, because other folk in the town may say, well, why would I support just the people who live there? But how much money are we spending on a per capita basis on our roads, which is invariably the biggest tax item in our towns? And I know people say, well, you have to do that because I've got to be able to drive to get to my house. But there's a fundamental equity issue there too, right? There's that tug and pull. It's really easy for us to kind of invest in the status quo. But then, and then the other issue too is, I don't know, I'll use my own personal example. I'm really thankful that my mom has an apartment in a village as her eyesight is failing, where she can continue to walk to the post office. She can continue to walk to the village market. She can walk to the bank. But more importantly, as her eyesight's failing, she's got neighbors who she can help her get across the street, or she can ask to take places. But we were just really lucky that she lucked in that apartment, because generally speaking, there are no other apartments to be had. And we keep her on the list, for Valley Cares. We need more facilities like Valley Cares, and you don't want to stick those out in the middle of nowhere. You want to put them in places that have goods and services. So as people age, even in those places, they can walk to goods and services. I live in Townsend now. I would love to see the village is very vital in some respects, but has no real commercial activity. Would love to have more places for those people who live at Valley Cares to walk to in the village center. And same thing for daycare and adult daycare, as opposed to taking people out to the middle of nowhere. Have a place, village centers where you can do other business, you can do other activities while you're waiting to pick up your child or your parent or whoever. That's a long answer to your question, Margot, but I've been waiting for that one.
Thanks. It was good.
We have another question from Walter.
My question is, how important is it for the town to acquire and own the property in order to be able to attract developers to do something. I'm thinking of, you know, a strip of a street which is just all dilapidated houses that are flop houses and whatever, right on the edge of, and actually I believe it's actually part of the designated downtown. And I keep on thinking that the town should just, you know, when these things come up for tax sale, or even when they're not on tax sale, but you know that the property owner is financially in trouble, that we shouldn't be making offers and just kind of picking up these properties. So we have a bunch of adjacent properties, and maybe, and also the other question is, should it be bare land or should the dilapidated houses be there before trying to get a developer to come in? Or is it better just to bulldoze the whole thing and have a nice strip of cleared land?
Yeah, Walter, what I would say is whatever you do, have a plan for it, know why you're doing it and what you're going to accomplish doing it, because you don't want to have like a very small scale, village version of urban renewal, where you go in and you tear down homes that could have potentially been rehabbed. And then you wind up with, like, I don't know, it's kind of like a gap tooth smile, right? You wind up with a house here and there, but then otherwise you've got cleared out property. I would say, be very intentional about it. Engage, like you can engage us, Regional Planning Commission, engage the state and others, get a grant, hire consultants to kind of walk through what is the strategy and who are the partners who are ultimately going to build. Just like, it's odd down, I used to live down south, and there they tend to be much less reluctant to build infrastructure, but then the planning catches up with that. Then they have to do the planning to kind of chase the infrastructure and deal with all kinds of problems that they have associated with unplanned growth. In Vermont, throughout New England, we tend to go the other way, which is we tend to do a lot of planning for intentional growth, but then not make the infrastructure investment. And so what I would just suggest is, talk to the housing trust, talk to private developers, and this could all be part of your housing development strategy about what makes the most sense in the community context. And also just being sensitive to the fact that if people are already living in those buildings, and their town, they're part of the community, and being mindful about where are they going to go, because otherwise, they have rights and needs and everything else just like everybody else, but that may be all they can afford. And so as you're thinking about removing any kind of housing, unless it's truly uninhabitable and uninhabited, make sure that in trying to solve one problem, you're not creating a whole other one. Jason, yeah.
Yeah, I know Walter and I know where he's talking about. I personally think if what he's referring to has been thought through a little bit, it's on water and sewer, and I think the question really is how can a town make stuff happen? And I would say, if you're looking at $300 a square foot, costs are kind of crazy. If there's anything a town can do to sort of incentivize things, reduce the costs, I think land banking or, those sorts of things are ideal. And I think, a nice scenario might be, the town acquires the property somehow. You might even hire an architect or somebody to come up with a plan for the building and even do a pro forma and just kind of, sort of do a developer's homework for them in terms of, what the town plan goals are and all that sort of thing. And that might help sweeten the pot. So I think that's something to think about. But I do think ownership is one of the various different mechanisms to make stuff happen. Tax stabilization, other things too are worth thinking about.
Patty? Thank you,
Yeah.
Jason.
Thanks. That was actually going to be my first question was, are you seeing more small towns put skin in the game and actually acquire properties? Chris, as you know, Londonderry, we're on the floodplain. So We're getting a lot of FEMA proposed buyouts for some of the village Main Street properties, and some of the owners are coming to the town kind of in a potential bargaining mode to either have the town buy out the properties, or they take the FEMA buyout. So they're wrestling with that type of decision. And I can't help but think, oh my gosh, town absolutely should be buying these properties. Because if you take a FEMA buyout, you lose it, from what I understand, completely.
Yeah, it reverts to town ownership and it has to be restored to floodplain.
Right. So essentially it's lost to development, future development, correct?
Well, so where can the new development go? And that's the kind of question. And both in your case, North Londonderry, I know South Londonderry has constraints of its own, but then, think about, how does Londonderry then develop? Because you could create one heck of an asset there, in the loss of one of structures that, now is the subject of repetitive flooding. Where can you move to where people feel more comfortable and safe investing, because they don't have to worry about flooding, but they could have access to an incredible riverside park. And I know it's not that easy. You don't just snap your fingers and make that happen, but communities around the country have done that. But I'll also just note that, speaking of buyouts, especially residential buyouts, there's a real problem now in that, we have people who have homes that put the people who live there and whatever's in those homes at great risk. But the challenge with the buyout is where are they going to move to? Because we have such a housing shortage. And so there's this whole chicken and egg aspect to it. But Patty, the other thing too is, I think this is, there are a number of towns, especially in the northern part of the state, that have probably done a bit more, and then larger towns that have done more kind of on creating conditions to encourage more investment in housing. But I think it's really new for a lot of smaller towns now, a lot of smaller villages, and that's where we're actually in the process of trying to hire an additional municipal and regional planner so that we can increase our bandwidth to help. Because I think a lot of people, if there's one benefit to the housing crisis that we're having now, is it seems like everyone is aware of it now, and kind of aware of the need. It used to be something I think that folks thought it was a problem for other people, but I'm really concerned that as our residents begin to age and need to, downsize, we're going to lose them because there's nowhere for them to go. And Del Boca Vista Phase 2 in Florida, we'd rather have folk here as opposed to ship them off someplace else.
Thank you.
Anything else? Well, thanks everybody for coming. This is recorded. I know I presented a lot. And if you have any feedback, feel free to email me or give me a call to say this was helpful, this was not. When I used to teach, we always figured out how to do the same lecture 3 times before I could finally get it right. So.
Well, thank you for your time. Interesting.
Yeah, great. And hopefully we'll see some of you in a couple weeks on our 3rd webinar that will focus on zoning.
That'll be the week after Thanksgiving.
Yes.
And happy Thanksgiving, everybody.
Have a good night.
Goodbye.